Hello and welcome back to Her Revenge Arc. My name is Alara, and tonight I want to tell you a story. It's a quiet story, one that didn't unfold in a boardroom or a courtroom, but in the soft, dark earth of a suburban garden. It's a story about the slow, creeping tyranny of petty people, and the patient, deliberate beauty of a revenge that grows, quite literally, from the ground up. It's about how the most satisfying victories aren't always the loudest, but are sometimes found in the full bloom of a rose, the perfect curve of a vine, and a single beautifully framed photograph. So find a comfortable place, pour yourself something warm, and let me tell you about my War of the Roses. It all began, as so many things do, with a search for peace. I had spent 15 years of my life in the city, in a steel and glass tower, working in corporate finance. My days were a relentless torrent of numbers, deadlines, and high-stakes negotiations. I lived by the shrill command of my phone. My sleep was fractured by phantom emails, and the only green the first saw was the color of money on a screen. I was successful by all conventional metrics. I had the apartment, the title, the salary, but a part of my soul, a quiet, essential part, was withering from a lack of sunlight. The decision to leave was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow dawning realization, like the morning light gradually illuminating a room you didn't realize was so dusty and cluttered. The catalyst was my grandmother's passing. She had been my anchor, the keeper of my childhood summers, a woman whose hands always smelled of soil and lavender. In her final days, she didn't speak of my career or my financial achievements. She spoke of the wisteria that climbed the porch of her old house, of the astonishing sweetness of a tomato warmed by the sun, of the satisfaction of seeing a seed you planted push its way toward the sky. When she was gone, the inheritance she left me wasn't just monetary. It was a legacy of a different way of living. I used that money to make a down payment on a small house in a quiet, leafy suburb called Willow Creek. It was a modest, unassuming place, but it had one feature that made my heart sing: a backyard. It was a sad, neglected rectangle of patchy grass and stubborn weeds, but to me it was a blank canvas. It was potential. It was freedom. I threw myself into the project with the same focus I'd once reserved for quarterly reports. My first few months were a blur of physical labor. I tore out the sad, thirsty lawn. I double-dug the beds until my back ached and my hands were raw, even through thick gloves. I built a composting system, turning my kitchen scraps into black gold. I read stacks of books on companion planting, soil health, and native species. This wasn't a hobby, it was a reclamation. I was reclaiming the land from neglect, and in doing so reclaiming myself from a life that had almost consumed me. My grandmother's voice was a constant presence in my mind. "Talk to your plants, Alara," she used to say, her eyes twinkling. "They listen." And so I did. I whispered encouragement to the timid clematis vine as I trained it onto a new trellis. I murmured apologies to the earthworms I accidentally disturbed. I celebrated with a quiet "well done" when the first true leaves of my cosmos seedlings unfurled. The garden became my sanctuary, my therapist, my gym, and my church. It was where I processed the grief of losing my grandmother and the hollow burnout of my former life. Every root that took hold felt like I was growing new roots of my own. The neighborhood was, for the most part, exactly what I'd hoped for. People smiled and waved on their morning walks. The family across the street had kids whose laughter was a constant, cheerful soundtrack. There was an unspoken agreement of live and let live. Except I soon learned, for the house directly to my right, number 24, the home of Robert and Carol Harrington. My first impression of their property was one of sterile perfection. Their lawn was a carpet of impossibly uniform, chemically green turf, mowed into diagonal stripes with military precision. Not a single dandelion or clover dared to show its face. The hedges were clipped into severe geometric shapes. The only flowers were tight, joyless clusters of red geraniums in identical terracotta pots, spaced exactly 12 inches apart along their pristine front walkway. Their house, a beige box just like mine, was immaculate to the point of being soulless. It was less a home and more a statement of rigid, suffocating control. My first interaction with them set the tone for everything that was to follow. I was on my knees, happily covered in mud, wrestling a particularly stubborn root ball out of the ground near our shared property line. I was so engrossed I didn't hear them approach. Quite the project you've undertaken. The voice was dry, devoid of warmth. I looked up, shielding my eyes from the sun, to see Robert Harrington standing on his perfect lawn, his arms crossed over his chest. He was a man in his late 50s, with a neatly trimmed silver mustache and a polo shirt tucked tightly into khaki shorts. He looked at my beautiful, chaotic mess of a garden in progress with an expression of deep suspicion, as if he'd just found a nest of hornets. "Oh, hello," I said, smiling and wiping a muddy hand on my jeans. "I'm Ulara. Just moved in." "We know," he said. "Robert Harrington. This is my wife, Carol." Carol, standing slightly behind him, was his perfect match. Her blonde hair was sprayed into a helmet of immobility. Her face was a mask of polite disdain. She gave me a tight, lipless smile that didn't reach her cold blue eyes. "It's certainly ambitious," Carol said, her gaze sweeping over my piles of compost, my bags of mulch, and my carefully laid-out plans sketched on a clipboard. The word ambitious was laced with something that sounded a lot like unseemly. "It's a labor of love," I replied, my cheerfulness undimmed. "I'm hoping to create a bit of an English cottage garden. Lots of flowers, a little wild and romantic." Robert's mustache twitched. "Wild," he repeated, as if it were a dirty word. "You'll want to be careful with that. This neighborhood has standards. We're on the HOA board, you know." It was not a friendly piece of information. It was a warning shot, fired across the bow before I'd even left port. "Of course," I said, my smile becoming a little more strained. "I've read the bylaws. Everything I'm planting is well within the guidelines." "We'll see," Carol said, her eyes narrowing on a patch of creeping thyme I was encouraging to grow between my new flagstones. "Things can get out of hand quickly if one isn't vigilant." They stood there for a moment longer, two statues of disapproval, before turning in perfect unison and marching back to their beige fortress. I watched them go, a small cold knot forming in my stomach. The warmth of the sun seemed to have diminished. My peaceful sanctuary suddenly had watchmen at the gates, and they did not like what they were seeing. Over the next year my garden flourished, and so did the Harringtons' campaign of passive aggression. My garden was designed to be a living, breathing ecosystem. It was a riot of color, texture, and life. Old-fashioned roses with heady scents climbed the fence, their thorny arms reaching for the sun. Lavender bushes hummed with the constant thrum of happy bees. Foxgloves stood like stately, spotted spires, and delphiniums provided shocks of brilliant blue. Butterflies, monarchs, swallowtails, cabbage whites danced from the milkweed to the buddleia. It was, to me and to most of the other neighbors who would often stop to admire it, a paradise. To the Harringtons it was an outrage. Their comments became a regular feature of my weekends. If Robert was out with his leaf blower, banishing any stray leaf that dared to land on his driveway, he'd make a point of shouting over the noise. "Those bees of yours are getting awfully close to our patio," he'd yell, even though I knew for a fact his patio was on the other side of his house. "They're just enjoying the lavender, Robert." I'd call back cheerfully. "Oomph," would be his only reply. Carol's method was more insidious. She would stand at her kitchen window, the one that overlooked my garden, and just watch me. I would be pruning my roses or weeding a bed, and I'd feel the prickle of her gaze on the back of my neck. Sometimes when I glanced up, she wouldn't even pretend to look away, just holding my gaze with that cold, judgmental stare. They complained about everything. The unpleasant odor of my compost bin, which was a state-of-the-art, fully enclosed tumbler that produced no smell whatsoever. The unruly nature of the morning glory vine, which I meticulously kept trimmed to my side of the fence. They even complained about the sound of my wind chimes, a gentle melodic gift from a friend, calling them a constant irritating noise. I took them down just to keep the peace. It was my first concession and I hated myself for it. The peace, however, was not to be kept. One Saturday afternoon, I found the first official letter from the Willow Creek Homeowners Association in my mailbox. The crisp white envelope felt strangely heavy in my hand. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. The letter, printed in a severe Times New Roman font, was a formal notice of violation. The subject, unkempt and overgrown foliage. It cited a vague bylaw about maintaining a neat and orderly appearance consistent with neighborhood standards. My crime, specifically, was a glorious 7-foot-tall sunflower that had grown near the back of my property. It was a magnificent specimen, a volunteer that had sprouted from a seed dropped by a bird. Its face was a perfect spiral of developing seeds, its petals the color of pure sunshine. It was a beacon of joy. Children from the neighborhood would point at it in awe. According to the HOA board on which I knew the Harringtons held significant, swaymy sunflower was an unacceptable vertical element that detracted from the uniform aesthetic of the community. I was given 14 days to remove it or face a fine of $50. I stood in my garden, the letter trembling in my hand, and looked at that beautiful sunflower, bowing its heavy head slightly in the breeze as if in shame. And I felt a surge of anger so pure and hot it almost took my breath away. This wasn't about a flower. This was about control. This was about their sterile, lifeless vision of the world being imposed upon my vibrant, living one. They wanted to legislate joy out of existence. My first instinct was to fight, to go to the next HOA meeting and plead my case, to show them pictures of my garden, to explain the ecological benefits, the haven I was creating for pollinators. But then I looked over at the Harringtons' house. I saw the curtain in the kitchen window twitch. They were watching. They were waiting. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that a public fight was exactly what they wanted. They would relish the drama. They would paint me as a difficult, non-conforming troublemaker. They would use the bureaucratic machinery of the HOA to grind me down. So, with a heavy heart, I did the last thing they expected. I complied. The next day, I took my sharpest clippers and I cut down my beautiful sunflower. Felt like a betrayal. As the great head thudded softly to the ground, I felt tears spring to my eyes. I left the stalk standing for a day, a sad, decapitated monument to my surrender. The following morning, I saw Robert Harrington out on his lawn, a small, triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He thought he had won. He thought he had broken me. In a way, he had. He had broken my desire to be accommodating. He had extinguished my willingness to compromise. And in doing so, he planted a new seed in my heart, a hard, resilient seed of defiance. The letters kept coming. They became a regular, dreaded delivery, each one a paper cut to my spirit. The war of attrition had begun. After the sunflower, the next violation was for my climbing rose, Zephyrine Drouhin. It's a beautiful, thornless bourbon rose with deep pink, cabbage-shaped flowers and the most intoxicating fragrance. I had trained it along the shared fence, and a few rebellious canes had arched gracefully over the top, offering their beauty to the Harrington side. The letter cited a bylaw against encroachment of foliage onto adjacent properties. It didn't matter that the encroachment consisted of a handful of fragrant blossoms. It was a violation. I was ordered to trim them back or face another fine. This time I didn't feel sad as I pruned them. I felt a cold, calculating rage. I snipped off each offending bloom with surgical precision, imagining I was severing their ties to a world of beauty they were incapable of appreciating. I left the pruned canes on their side of the fence, a small, passive-aggressive pile of wilted flowers. They were gone within the hour, no doubt deposited into a trash bag with sterilized tongs. Next it was the mint. I had a small patch of spearmint in a raised bed, well contained and far from the property line. It was my source for tea and for mojitos on hot summer evenings. A new letter arrived, this one more creative. It accused me of cultivating an invasive species that posed a potential threat to the integrity of neighborhood lawns. The letter was full of dark warnings about how mint rhizomes could travel underground for yards, choking out the precious turf of my neighbors. It was, of course, a ridiculous exaggeration. My mint was as contained as a goldfish in a bowl. But the accusation was on paper, official and threatening. I stood there, reading the letter, and I could almost hear Carol's voice dictating the words, her face tight with sanctimonious concern. The integrity of the lawns, Robert. We must protect the integrity. I imagined them poring over the HOA bylaws with a magnifying glass, searching for any turn of phrase, any clause they could twist to their purpose. My garden wasn't just an annoyance to them. It was a personal obsession. My joy was their poison. Each letter chipped away at my peace. The garden, once my refuge, started to feel like a liability. I found myself looking at my plants not with love, but with a critical, anxious eye. Was this hollyhock too tall? Was this patch of bee balm spreading too aggressively? Was the color of this lupin too loud? I started to feel their cold, judgmental eyes even when they weren't there. I was internalizing their criticism, and it was slowly poisoning my wellspring of happiness. I would be on my knees tending to my columbines, and a wave of anxiety would wash over me. What would they find to complain about next? The way the wind blew the poppy petals? The very existence of earthworms? The breaking point, the moment the cold rage solidified into a diamond-hard resolve, came in late autumn. It was a letter about my leaves. I had several beautiful mature trees in my yard, including a magnificent Japanese maple that turned a fiery, breathtaking scarlet in the fall. I loved the leaves. I loved the rustling sound they made, the crunchy carpet they laid upon the earth. I practiced what gardeners call leaf litter mulching, allowing the leaves to decompose naturally in my flower beds over the winter, enriching the soil and protecting the roots of my perennials. It was an organic, sustainable, and time-honored practice. The Harringtons naturally saw it as a sign of the apocalypse. Their letter, co-signed by both of them in their capacity as concerned neighbors and HOA board members, was a masterpiece of manufactured hysteria. It described my beautiful fallen leaves as unhygienic debris and a harborage for vermin and disease. It claimed the leaves would blow onto their meticulously maintained property and contaminate their sterile lawn. It was an insult not only to my gardening philosophy but to nature itself. The letter concluded with the new, escalated threat. If I did not remediate the situation by raking, bagging, and disposing of all fallen leaves from my entire property within 7 days, the HOA would hire a professional landscaping company to do it for me and bill me for the service, along with the hefty non-compliance penalty. I held that letter in my hand as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across my yard. The scarlet leaves of the maple seemed to glow with an inner fire. I looked at the rich, dark soil of my flower beds, waiting to be nourished by them. And I looked over at the beige house, the perfect lawn, the soulless, flowerless pots. I saw a vision of their world. Sterile, controlled, colorless, and silent. And I knew I could not let them win. Not this time. But I wasn't going to fight them on their terms. An argument at an HOA meeting would be futile. A legal challenge would be costly and draining. No, my response had to be different. It had to be something they could never anticipate. It had to be a victory so complete, so public, and so irrefutable that it would silence them forever. It had to be a revenge that was not ugly or destructive, but beautiful and creative. I went inside and sat at my kitchen table, the offensive letter lying next to me. I made myself a cup of the very spearmint tea they had so maligned, and I thought. My gaze drifted to the local newspaper lying on the counter, folded open to the community section. And that's when I saw it. A small advertisement, boxed in with the simple line drawing of a rose. The annual citywide Garden of the Year competition. Is your garden the pride of the city? Enter now. Judging in July. Grand prize, a feature in the City Herald, and the coveted Golden Trowel Trophy. A slow smile spread across my face. It was an audacious, almost laughable idea. My little suburban garden, born of grief and rebellion, against the grand estates and professionally landscaped masterpieces of the entire city. But the more I thought about it, the more perfect it seemed. The Harringtons had used public scrutiny and official channels as their weapon. They had tried to shame me with letters and bylaws. What if I invited a higher authority of public scrutiny? What if I submitted my garden to be judged, not by their petty restrictive standards, but by the standards of true horticultural excellence? Winning wasn't even the point, not at first. The point was the act of defiance. The point was to declare, my garden is not a violation. It is a work of art. But then a more delicious thought began to form. What if I did win? What would be the prize? A feature in the newspaper. A photograph. A photograph of me, the proud winner, standing in my glorious, unruly, overgrown, vermin-infested garden. A photograph that would be seen by everyone in our town. And then the final perfect detail of the fantasy clicked into place. The angle of the photograph. From where would the photographer have to stand to get the best shot, to capture the full sweep of the delphiniums, the arch of the roses, the depth of the beds? They would have to stand near my front walkway looking back towards the house. And what would be in the background, just over my shoulder, perfectly framed by the climbing clematis on the trellis? Number 24. The Harringtons' house. I imagined their faces, peering out their window watching the proceedings. Their expressions of disbelief, turning to horror, as they realized what was happening. I imagined their scowling, impotent faces, immortalized in the background of my victory portrait. The thought was so exquisitely satisfying it was almost intoxicating. The seed of revenge had been planted, and I was going to nurture it with all the patience, dedication, and meticulous care I had given to my garden. The war was about to enter a new phase. It would be a long, quiet campaign, waged over the next 8 months with soil, seeds, and strategy. And the Harringtons would never see it coming. My decision to enter the citywide Garden of the Year competition transformed my relationship with my garden. It was no longer just a sanctuary or a battlefield. It was now a training ground. I had 8 months until the judging in July. 8 months to turn my beloved, slightly chaotic cottage garden into a contender for a major prize. This was not a task I took lightly. My previous career had taught me the value of meticulous research, strategic planning, and flawless execution. I would apply that same rigor to soil and petals. First, I dealt with the immediate threat. The letter about the leaves. I didn't fight it. I didn't argue. I complied, but in my own way. Over the next few days, I painstakingly raked every single beautiful leaf from my lawn and beds. I could feel the Harringtons' smug satisfaction radiating from their house. They thought they had won another battle. What they didn't see was me carefully layering those leaves into my compost bins, mixing them with green matter, turning my unhygienic debris into the very fuel that would power my victory. They had, in their ignorance, handed me a mountain of free, high-quality organic matter. Then the research began. I became a detective. I went to the library and dug up back issues of the City Herald, looking at the feature articles on previous winners of the competition. I analyzed the photographs, studying the types of gardens that had won. There was a pattern. The judges, who were typically from the City Botanical Society and the Master Gardeners program, weren't looking for sterile perfection. They didn't reward the kind of rigid, chemical-dependent landscaping the Harringtons worshipped. They prized creativity, health, sustainability, and what they called four-season interest. They loved gardens with a story, gardens that showed a deep, personal connection between the gardener and the land. They loved biodiversity. They loved pollinators. My heart soared. They were looking for a garden just like mine, only elevated to its absolute peak of potential. I also researched the judges themselves. I found their names on the Botanical Society's website. I read articles they had written, blogs they had posted. One was a renowned expert on heritage roses. Another was a passionate advocate for native plants and pollinator habitats. The third was an artist who specialized in garden design and the use of color and texture. This was invaluable intelligence. I now had a roadmap. I wasn't going to change the soul of my garden, but I was going to strategically enhance the elements that would speak directly to their passions. The winter months were for planning and preparation. My kitchen table disappeared under a sea of seed catalogs, graph paper, and gardening books. I drew up detailed plans for each bed, considering bloom times, color combinations, and plant heights with the precision of a military strategist. I wasn't just planting flowers. I was choreographing a symphony of blooms that would reach its crescendo in mid-July. I ordered seeds for rare and unusual varieties they wouldn't see in every garden. A deep, velvety black hollyhock called Nigra, a delicate, lace-like flower called Orlea grandiflora, a variety of zinnia with an unusual lime green tint. For the rose expert, I decided to add 2 more heritage roses to my collection, a Comte de Chambord and a Souvenir de la Malmaison, both known for their exquisite form and fragrance. I researched their specific needs for soil pH and sunlight, choosing their locations with immense care. For the native plant advocate, I planned a new pollinator corner. I sourced seeds for swamp milkweed, purple coneflower, and wild bergamot. I designed a small bee hotel made from bamboo canes and a log with drilled holes. This wasn't just for show. It was a genuine expansion of my garden's ecological purpose, but its strategic value was undeniable. For the artist, I focused on flow and composition. I planned to create pathways that would meander, inviting a slow, deliberate journey through the garden rather than a quick overview. I would use repeating elements, like the silvery leaves of lamb's ear, to create rhythm and cohesion. I planned to use plants with interesting foliage, the deep burgundy of a heuchera, the chartreuse of a Hakone grass to ensure the garden was beautiful even when some flowers were not in bloom. All of this was done in secret. From the Harringtons' perspective, my garden was entering its dormant winter phase. They saw me clearing beds and spreading compost me leaf mold, as I now called it with private satisfaction. They probably assumed I had been cowed into a more tidy approach. They had no idea I was laying the foundations for a horticultural masterpiece. Spring arrived and the real work began. I started my seeds indoors under grow lights, turning my spare bedroom into a makeshift nursery. The quiet joy of seeing those first tiny green shoots emerge was my fuel. I talked to them just as my grandmother had taught me. "You're going to be a winner," I'd whisper to a tray of delphinium seedlings. "You're going to show them what real beauty is." As the weather warmed, I was outside from dawn until dusk. I amended my soil with my homemade compost until it was dark, crumbly, and teeming with life. I transplanted my precious seedlings, hardening them off with painstaking care. I installed a discreet drip irrigation system to ensure every plant received the perfect amount of water without waste. A nod to sustainability that I knew the judges would appreciate. The Harringtons watched, of course. Their surveillance was constant. I learned to ignore the twitching curtains, the cold stares over the fence. I would put on my headphones not to listen to music, but to create a bubble of silence, a zone of focus where their negativity could not penetrate. My work was my meditation. The repetitive motion of weeding, the careful act of staking a tall lily, the gentle spray of neem oil to organically ward off aphids, it all became a ritual, a prayer for the future. There were moments of doubt, of near disaster. A late frost in May threatened my tender zinnias, and I spent a frantic night covering them all with sheets and blankets, my breath pluming in the cold air. An infestation of Japanese beetles appeared in June, and I spent hours every morning, hand-picking the iridescent pests off my rose bushes and dropping them into a bucket of soapy water, refusing to resort to the harsh pesticides the Harringtons likely used on their lawn. Each challenge overcome only strengthened my resolve. This garden was becoming a testament to my perseverance. As June bled into July, the garden began to explode. My planning and hard work were paying off in a way that exceeded my wildest dreams. The color combinations were breathtaking. The deep purples of the salvia played against the bright yellows of the coreopsis. The soft pinks of the cosmos danced above the silvery artemisia. The air was thick with the scent of roses, lavender, and sweet alyssum. The sound was a constant hum of bees and the flutter of butterfly wings. My garden was more alive than it had ever been. It was a symphony, and the crescendo was building. A week before the judging, I submitted my official application, complete with the short essay on my gardening philosophy. I wrote about my grandmother, about creating a sustainable habitat, about the garden as a place of healing and joy. I poured my heart onto the page. I received a confirmation email a few days later. The judges would be visiting on Thursday, July 15th at 2 p.m. The day of the judging dawned bright and clear. I was up at sunrise, too nervous to sleep. I walked through the garden one last time, not as a worker, but as an observer. It was perfect. A dewdrop trembled on the edge of a rose petal. A fat bumblebee snored softly inside a squash blossom. The light filtered through the leaves of the Japanese maple, dappling the path in shades of green and gold. I felt a profound sense of peace. Whatever happened, I had created this. This was my truth. I spent the morning in a state of quiet, focused anticipation. I deadheaded a few spent blooms, swept the flagstone path, and filled the bird baths with fresh water. I put on a simple linen dress, something that felt appropriate for a gardener receiving guests. At 1:55 p.m., a sensible sedan pulled up to the curb. 3 people got out, clipboards in hand. It was them, the judges. As they walked up my front path, I took a deep breath. From the corner of my eye, I saw it. The curtain in the Harrington's front window twitched, then pulled back an inch. They were in position. The audience was seated. The show was about to begin. I greeted the judges with a calm smile, though my heart was doing a frantic tap dance against my ribs. I introduced myself and welcomed them to my garden. The first judge, a kind-faced woman with a knowledgeable air, was indeed Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the rose expert. The second, a man with a weathered face and a genuine enthusiasm in his eyes, was Mr. David Chun, the native plant advocate. The third, a chic woman with an artist's eye for detail, was Dr. Isabella Rossi. "What a charming entrance," Dr. Rossi commented immediately, gesturing to the archway over my front gate, which was smothered in the fragrant pale pink blossoms of the new dawn climbing rose. "You've created a wonderful sense of arrival." I led them not on a direct tour, but on the meandering path I had designed. I let the garden speak for itself, only offering information when they asked, or pointing out a small significant detail. I talked about how I had built the soil from scratch. I explained my composting methods. I pointed out the different species of bees visiting the bergamot. Mrs. Vance spent a long time with my roses. She gently cupped a bloom of the Souvenir de la Malmaison in her hand, inhaling its scent. "Perfection," she murmured. "And no sign of black spot. Your cultural practices must be impeccable. You don't spray with harsh chemicals, do you?" "No," I said, my voice steady. "Only neem oil, and I try to build a healthy ecosystem so the plants can defend themselves." I glanced towards the Harrington's house. I couldn't see them, but I could feel their presence, their silent, impotent rage growing with every positive comment from the judges. Dr. Rossi was focused on the composition. "I adore how you've used the silver of the lamb's ear to lead the eye through this border," she said, pointing. "And the contrast in textures between the delicate fronds of this fern and the bold leaves of the hosta is simply masterful. This is not just a collection of plants. It's a painting." They spent nearly an hour and a half in my garden. They looked at everything, from the health of the foliage to the structure of the handmade trellises. As they were preparing to leave, standing near my front door, Mrs. Vance turned to me, a warm smile on her face. "Your garden is a very special place, Ms. Alara," she said. "It has what so many gardens lack, a soul." After they drove away, a profound silence descended. The garden seemed to be holding its breath. I looked over at number 24. The curtain fell back into place. The vigil was over. I went inside, my body trembling with the mixture of adrenaline and exhaustion. I had done it. I had presented my case. Now all I could do was wait for the verdict. The 2 weeks that followed the judge's visit were a unique form of torture. Every time the phone rang, my heart leaped into my throat. Every email notification made me jump. I tried to distract myself, to lose myself in the simple rhythmic tasks of garden maintenance, but the question mark of the competition loomed over everything. I saw very little of the Harringtons during this time. Their usual weekend patrols of their property seemed to have ceased. I would catch a glimpse of Carol's face at the window, her expression unreadable, before she would quickly retreat. Robert's leaf blower remained silent. It was an uneasy truce, a holding pattern. They were waiting, just as I was, to see what would come of it all. Their silence was more unnerving than their complaints. It was the quiet before a storm, but whose storm it would be remained to be seen. I oscillated wildly between hope and despair. One moment, I would replay the judge's positive comments in my mind, the warmth in Mrs. Vance's voice, Mr. Chen's genuine excitement. I would feel a surge of confidence. My garden was special, did have a soul. The next moment, doubt would creep in. I would remember the sheer size of the city, the number of grand, long-established gardens with professional designers and unlimited budgets. Who was I, with my small patch of earth and my grandmother's wisdom, to compete with that? I was setting myself up for a fall, for a quiet, private humiliation that would somehow feel worse than the Harringtons' public attacks. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 16 days after the judging, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, my nerves frayed. But something compelled me to answer. "Hello," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Hello, may I speak with Alara?" The voice was warm and professional. "This is she." "Alara. This is Eleanor Vance, head of the judging committee for the Citywide Garden of the Year competition." My breath caught in my chest. My knuckles were white where I gripped the edge of the counter. This was it. "We had a great number of truly exceptional entries this year," she began, and my heart sank. It was the standard preamble to a polite rejection. I braced myself for the But, she continued, "the committee was unanimous in its decision. Your garden, with its breathtaking beauty, its commitment to sustainability, and its profound personal narrative, stood out above all the rest. Congratulations, Alara. You are this year's winner." For a moment I was completely silent. I couldn't process the words. Winner. The word echoed in the sudden vast stillness of my kitchen. Tears pricked my eyes, tears of shock, of relief, of a joy so overwhelming it was almost painful. "Are you still there, dear?" Mrs. Vance asked, a gentle chuckle in her voice. "Yes," I finally managed to say, my voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I'm here. Thank you. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll be available for a photo shoot with the City Herald this Friday," she said happily. "They want to do a full-page feature for the Sunday edition. The photographer, a Mr. Finn, will call you to arrange a time." We spoke for a few more minutes. She told me about the awards ceremony where I would receive the Golden Trowel Trophy. But my mind was already racing, focusing on one single glorious detail. The photo shoot. The final piece of my plan was about to fall into place. The photographer, Mr. Finn, called an hour later. He was brisk and efficient. "Friday morning has the best light," he said. "How about 10 o'clock? 10 o'clock is perfect," I said. Friday morning arrived, just as beautiful as the day of the judging. I didn't feel nervous this time. I felt a sense of calm, powerful certainty. I had chosen my outfit with care. A simple but elegant blue dress, a color that would stand out beautifully against the greens and pinks of the garden. At precisely 10 a.m., Mr. Finn's van pulled up. He was a lanky man with a kind, crinkled smile and a camera bag that looked like it had seen the world. As he began to set up his equipment, I saw the curtain at number 24 twitch. Of course, they wouldn't miss this for the world. They had to see the final act of what they probably assumed would be my quiet, inconsequential little victory. "Wow," Mr. Finn said, looking around. Mrs. Vance wasn't kidding. "This place is magical. Where do we even start?" "I have an idea for the main portrait," I said, my voice smooth and even. "The shot that will really capture the essence of the garden." I led him to the spot I had envisioned months ago, near my front walkway. From this vantage point, the garden unfolded behind the subject in glorious layers. In the immediate foreground were the soft, silvery mounds of lamb's ear and the deep purple salvia. Behind that, the magnificent spires of the delphiniums and foxgloves rose up, creating a wall of color. And framing the entire scene was the trellis by my front door, now covered in a cascade of purple clematis. It was a perfect composition. "This is brilliant," he said, peering through his lens. "The depth, the layering of color, it's stunning. Okay, if you could stand right about there." He pointed to a spot on the path. I moved into position, and then I executed the final crucial step of my plan. "You know," I said, as if the thought had just occurred to me, "the light is hitting the clematis so beautifully. Could you perhaps move a few feet to your left? I think it would frame the shot even better." He obliged, shuffling his tripod a few feet over. It was a subtle adjustment, almost imperceptible, but it changed everything. From his new position, the lens was no longer aimed just at me and my garden. It was aimed perfectly to include, just over my right shoulder, a clear, unobstructed view of the Harrington's front window. "Perfect," he said, his eye pressed to the viewfinder. "That's the money shot right there. Okay, Alara." Big smile. "Look proud. You've earned it." I smiled. It was not a small, polite smile. It was a wide, genuine, triumphant grin, A smile that radiated every ounce of my hard-won joy and vindication. I angled my body slightly, my head held high, and looked directly into the camera lens. And as I held that pose, I let my gaze flicker, just for a second, past the photographer to the window of number 24. And I saw them. I saw them both. Robert and Carol Harrington standing side by side, their faces pressed close to the glass. They were not hiding. They were staring transfixed like horrified spectators at a crash they had caused. Their faces were masks of pure, undiluted fury. Robert's mouth was a thin, hard line, his silver mustache seeming to bristle with indignation. Carol's face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and utter disbelief. Their expressions were so vivid, so perfectly captured in that moment of their ultimate defeat, that it was almost cinematic. They had built their entire world around control, and here in my garden was a force of nature and will that they could not control, a victory they could not undermine. All they could do was watch, their faces contorted in a silent scream of impotent rage. "Hold that!" Mr. Finn called out. "Beautiful!" Click. The sound of the shutter was crisp and final. It was the sound of a lock turning, a verdict being delivered, a chapter ending. It was the sound of my victory being immortalized. The rest of the shoot was a pleasant blur. Mr. Finn took photos of individual flowers, of the pollinator garden, of the meandering paths. But I knew which photo would be chosen for the feature. The one with the perfect light, the perfect smile, and the perfect scowling background. 2 days later, on Sunday morning, I walked to the end of my driveway to pick up the newspaper. My hands were steady. I unfolded the paper and there it was. Not on an inside page but right on the front of the lifestyle section. A huge, glorious, full-color photograph under a banner headline. Local woman's sanctuary named City's Garden of the Year. The photo was even better than I had imagined. The colors of the garden were vibrant and alive. My smile was radiant. And there, in the background just over my shoulder, were the Harringtons. The newspaper print wasn't high definition, but it didn't need to be. Their expressions were perfectly, comically clear. Two furious, scowling faces, trapped behind the glass of their beige prison, forever framed by the triumphant arch of my clematis vine. They were a permanent, public footnote to my success. I took the newspaper and a pair of scissors and carefully cut out the article. I didn't frame it and hang it on my wall. That would have been too obvious, too boastful. Instead, I laminated it. And the next time I was working in my garden, near the shared property line, I left it lying on my small gardening bench, the photo facing their house where I knew they would see it. I left it there all day. The aftermath was exactly as I had hoped. A profound and beautiful silence. The HOA letters stopped. The passive-aggressive comments ceased. The judgmental stares from the window ended. It was as if a dark cloud that had been hanging over my property had finally dissipated, allowing the sun to shine through fully. Other neighbors, who had perhaps been intimidated by the Harringtons' reign on the HOA board, now felt free to be more open. They came by not just to admire the garden, but to congratulate me. They brought small gifts, a bottle of wine, a plate of cookies. They told me they had seen the article and the photograph. A few of them, in hushed, conspiratorial tones, even mentioned the hilarious expressions on the Harringtons' faces in the background. My quiet, personal victory had become a small, celebrated neighborhood legend. The Harringtons retreated into their beige box. Their lawn remained perfect, their hedges severe, but they seemed diminished. Their power, which was built on the perception of control and the petty enforcement of rules, had been publicly and beautifully undone. I had not played their game. I had created a new one with rules they didn't understand, and I had won. My revenge was not loud or destructive. It was quiet and green and patient. It grew from the earth, fueled by their own negativity. Every flower they had tried to suppress, every leaf they had condemned, had become a soldier in my silent army. And the final blow was not a shout, but a smile captured forever in newsprint. My garden is still my sanctuary, but it's no longer a place of conflict. It is a place of peace, a testament to the idea that the best response to ugliness is not to stoop to its level, but to cultivate overwhelming, irrefutable beauty. And so I ask you, as you reflect on my story, Have you ever found yourself in a situation where the best revenge was not to fight fire with fire, but to build something beautiful and lasting in its place? A victory not of destruction but of creation? I would love to read your own stories and thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening to her revenge arc. If this story resonated with you, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribing to the channel for more stories of quiet, clever, and satisfying justice. Until next time.